Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here on my lecture recital on Leo Ornstein's Piano Sonatas number 4 and number 8. I've been really excited about the music of Ornstein ever since I heard it a couple of years ago. I was wanting to round out a concert program with something unusual and substantial and beautiful, and I was researching several composers on Naxos Online, and Ornstein was one of them that I came across. And after hearing the fourth movement of his fourth sonata, for some reason I listened to the last movement first, I was intrigued by his music, and also further intrigued that it was so obscure and no one seemed to have known about Ornstein. So I decided to pursue an in-depth study on his music, and I chose the two in-point sonatas, the number 4 and the number 8, his first and last, because there's a vast difference between them, 66 years, because Ornstein lived to be 108 years old, and I thought that fact was staggering, and it made it very interesting to compare and see his development and approach to these two sonatas through the years. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the following. First of all, a big thank you to my advisor, Dr. Posnack, for all of your guidance and assistance throughout this project, your time and patience. Without you, it would not have been possible. To Dr. Floyd for many sessions of the sonatas number 4 and 8 in preparing these for performance. Also a thank you to the rest of my committee, Professor Ying, Professor Johnson. Also a big thank you to Dr. Cam and Dr. Wilson. I'd like to say a special thank you to the University of Miami's GAFAC organization. This is the Graduate Assistant Fee Allocation Committee. And they were very instrumental in this project in that they provided travel assistance for me to go to Palo Alto, California to perform Ornstein on the Poon Hill Recital series. And not only this, but I had the opportunity to have invaluable conversations with the composer's son, Severo Ornstein, which just added a whole new dimension to my project, so I'm very grateful to the GAFAC organization. Last, I'd like to thank internationally recognized pianist Janice Weber and Marc-Andre Hamelin for their interesting conversations and their generous time regarding the performance approach of these two sonatas. Janice Weber has recorded the 4th sonata on the Naxos label, and Marc-Andre Hamelin has recorded the 8th on the Hyperion label, and these two are the only ones that have recorded these works that we know of on labels. I'd like to start with a brief biographical sketch of Leo Ornstein. This is him pictured as a teenager at the height of his fame, and then again at age 107. He was an incredibly internationally recognized concert pianist in the 1920s. He was also a composer and later a teacher as well. One of the most striking features about Ornstein is his longevity, and his life spanned over 3 centuries of time, from the late 19th century. He was born in 1893 and died in 2002, and for someone to span 3 centuries is certainly unusual. Leo Ornstein was born in Kremenchuk in 1893, although some records in Russia indicated December of 1892, but he always claimed his birthday to be in February of 1893. And he studied at many prestigious schools with the help of his father, who was a Jewish cantor, and his uncle, a violinist. And these two took a real interest in his musical studies early on, when it became obvious that he was a piano prodigy. One of the most influential pianists that heard him when Ornstein was only 8 years old was Joseph Hoffman, and he was the one that recommended him for study at the Moscow Conservatory. So here we have a list of very prestigious schools that he attended. And this is a visual of where he was born, Kremenchuk, in the Ukrainian province of Poltava in Russia. This was under Russian imperial rule at the time, which leads me to the next. 1906 was right after the start of the Russian Revolution, and the first real start of the revolts that unleashed many anti-Semitic mobs in the areas, and this resulted in a very repressive regime that forced many Jewish families to escape or emigrate and to be uprooted. So for this reason, the Ornstein family got out. They immigrated to America in 1906, and they settled in New York, and Ornstein at that time was an early teen. Once in New York, Ornstein enrolled himself in the Musical Institute, later known as the Juilliard School of Music, and he studied with Bertha Tapper, and she was influential in launching his concert career, taking him on tours and promoting his playing. And his debut in New York was in 1911, and this was a very conventional program, but he soon began to incorporate new works of his own and works of his contemporaries. You can see some that are listed there. And this drew quite a reaction from audiences and mixed reactions from critics. And for this reason in his programming of incorporating his own works, which were very harmonically confusing to audiences at times, he was labeled as an ultra-futurist or ultra-modernist because of his compositional techniques, which included the prominent use of clusters, the dissonances, and just a general aggregation of formal structure. Ornstein hated being categorized, and he concluded that audiences were only interested in novelty. So he was happy to turn away from the concertizing lifestyle in the 1930s. Upon hearing his first compositions, his teacher, Bertha Fearing-Tapper, thought he was actually insane, and she had to hear each composition several times to understand the structure behind it and to understand what was going on, because this was so unusual at the time to write in this style. He was happy to turn away from the public eye because the critics and the audiences had pinholed him into this ultra-futurist, ultra-modernist category, and he also wanted to write conventional works, but the reaction was mixed. They liked for him to compose in one style or the other. So his last public performance was in 1933. There were other reasons as well, the pressure of concertizing, his nervous nature. He was a compulsive perfectionist, and he also thought that he had a small hand. And later you'll see a picture of him, which I think his hand is not so small at all, but maybe he was comparing it to one of his contemporaries like Rachmaninoff, who had enormous hands. But he dedicated his time to teaching and to composing at that point. I'd like to turn to his compositional style. Above are some of the characteristics, and these are found in both sonatas, the fourth and the eighth. And these became more prominent and complicated in the eighth sonata, especially the variational development aspect. And you'll see that the level of complexity in his compositions in 66 years reached symphonic proportions. The fourth piano sonata was written in 1924, and this was the first notated piano sonata. There were three others, but these were not notated. He did not write them out. He performed them in public frequently, but eventually these were lost in time. And instead of renumbering, Severo Ornstein, his son who cataloged his works, kept it true to the original format. So this is still the fourth piano sonata, although the three were lost. This sonata is in standard textbook sonata form, sonata allegro form, and I'd like to just point out the themes to listen for in the first movement. This is the first theme that you will hear. And the second theme is a good example of how he embeds the melody inside these layers of dissonance and clusters. So that is the second theme. Some more characteristics are the tonal bass sonorities and this vertical piling up of different contrapuntal voicings and sonorities, again for this huge, huge effect and this wash of sound. Although his process was almost exclusively internal, there are some external influences of his contemporaries, of what he heard around, and you'll hear Stravinsky, Bartók, Schoenberg, all under similar influences. A big one in this particular piece is Debussy. And I'd like to play two excerpts from this first movement of the fourth sonata that are fairly direct quotes, like an homage to the Debussy Clair de Lune. And so you see, first of all, it comes in the middle. And then later it appears towards the end of the sonata. direct Debussy quote. I'd like to speak a little bit about the other movements before playing the entire first movement of the Fourth Sonata. The second movement is in a standard form as well. His earlier works are very much more structured than the later ones. This is in ABA, and you'll see above some of the characteristics that are contained here. The Hebraic melodies, in other words, modal minor, harmonic minor passages, Russian folk influences, and an overall characteristic of this movement is the stark contrast between the sections. And this only intensifies when he gets, by the time that he gets to his eighth sonata. Here we have a very languid, settee-like, almost waltz in the very beginning. I'll just play the opening of the sections that it's sandwiched between. Languid feel until a very abrupt change in the middle, contrast. And another side of the A. You can see this final chord is a very good example of his use of bitonality also, and these huge dissonance and clusters. Now you have on top, and then with the C pedal push. And then right after that, you have that Hebraic wailing type of motion with the harmonic minors. Obviously an influence of his father's days as a cantor as well. I'd like to move on to the third movement. This is very nature-inspired with constant figures reminiscent of bird calls throughout. And it has a very improvisational feel, and it's fairly harmonically static. There's a feeling of ambiguity that never really settles until the very end when you have big pedal points to kind of lock into. Later we'll find in the eighth sonata there's also similar bird-like material, and one of the themes that keeps coming back. These characteristics even predate Messiaen's use in several of his works in the 40s and 50s of this type of bird call. And it also has a sound of Jewish mysticism to it. So I'd like to play a little example of the first swatch of the third movement. The whole movement remains in that atmosphere. The fourth movement is a lengthy rondo, again a standard form. And here you can see the original theme in its form and some of the many returns that comes back. You can see how he plays with the texture to vary these returns. And again, there's a clear modal minor, harmonic minor influence of cantor-like quality. So I'd like to play the theme from the fourth movement in its original form. This is the movement, by the way, that struck me, made such an impression. It's just, it's very fresh and motion-oriented. It has a sense of momentum throughout. And the triads also make for a thick texture without slowing it down. Original form. And then you can also see how many times this A section comes back, sandwiched in between other material. I'll play a few of these examples. Here he opens it out. The texture now is in open fifths and octaves. was interesting because you have the same figuration, but now in these dissonant clusters and adding an intensity. He also marks many times in this sonata and also in the eighth, in modo barbaro or burlesca, these words that he uses frequently to describe the texture and the motion of the passage. Cluster chord to end that section. So that's another one. A more languid calm in the center. You can see how this is even a different feel, but the same material. And another one, more reminiscent of the bird call material. The final example there is opened out the fifths and octaves as in the earlier, except it's just in another key. And one of the challenges here is keeping the material fresh because it does return so many times, but he writes it in such an interesting way and varies the texture enough so that it really plays itself, begins to play itself. Now I'd like to play the entire first movement of this sonata to point out some of the elements that I discussed. So this is the first sonata, or the first movement of the sonata number 4, which is his first notated sonata. written 66 years later in 1990. The first movement has 6 separate themes, which I found astonishing in practicing learning this and analyzing it. And organizing the movement was kind of like a process of cartography. The scale of the work is enormous, and this is more comparable to a late Romantic symphonic work, how he's progressed. And interestingly, at the time there was a kind of an outbreak of minimalism in certain circles going on. And it goes to show that he did not follow the trends, but what he quoted as what the music demanded. Whatever he felt or heard in his head, he would always write it on paper as it was. I even heard an audio clip of him in the process of composing, and he was struggling to get on paper exactly what he was hearing in his head over and over. So he wrote very much for what the music demanded. These are some of the characteristics here, the dialogue between sections. It's like a large cast of characters in a play. Fragmentation is a characteristic that he uses a lot. Not only fragments, truncates, expands, and develops these themes, but also in connecting material, bridges, different sections of barbaro and burlesca, as he likes to notate in the score. And there is a unifying rhythmic gesture that keeps coming back also in the third movement of this sonata for a kind of breathless quality of an 8th rest or a 16th rest, oftentimes starting a big section. So you have that kind of before the section goes and snowballs. This is a map of the first movement, and I went through and organized it just to make very clear what happens. Here you can see how the 6 themes are presented in one big section, which I lumped into what you could call an exposition, although in analyzing it, it's much better to think of it in sections. So section 1 is also a quasi-exposition after the introduction. In the bridge, you'll see that there is, I put plus barbaro. This is actually part of the bridge, but again, he has deemed it important to notate this separately, a different idea, something very, very distinctive. The section 2, or the quasi-development, is where he starts to bring back different themes and develops them. And again, this second time appearance of the bridge is a prime version of his first bridge material, which is unusual. The third section, which could also be termed as a recapitulation, is where you have a huge splash of the theme 1 very clearly coming back. And then how he takes a few more of the themes and develops them even further. You can see the scope of this work. Even the first movement alone is enormous, symphonic proportions and very layered. And the coda, again, is a very specific theme 1, which you'll see in more detail in a minute. It's a very Lisztian type of writing, where he has, again, the melody on top floating, but underneath this chaotic material, with even a counter melody going on in the left-hand thumb. So it's almost like 3 separate, it is like 3 separate distinct things going on. So I'd like to go into a little more detail on some of the themes. I'd like to talk about theme 1, 4, and 6. Each theme is very unique and has interesting characteristics. In the interest of time, I will do these 3. So you can see here, theme 1 is the signature use of the strong melodic line over the chaotic material again. So I'd like to play some of these examples so you can hear what to listen for. And at first it sounds very, very dissonant and chaotic, but here's the melody. And each theme contains a very clear melody like this, nothing unusual, but it's underneath all of the chaos that makes it interesting. I'd also like to play a few more of those returns. When theme 1 comes back again, same material, this time different key. Another appearance, when it comes back at the recap, again a different key. now in groups of 5. And the final Lisztian one, which I think is very interesting, is a big splash that takes up almost the entire coda. And this time it's thicker in both parts with an added voice, very overwhelming. And so on. You'll hear the whole splash of that in a bit. Theme 4, I chose to illustrate theme 4 because he had very specific images in mind when he composed. Not only he would hear the notes, but he'd have pictures pop into his head, and even directly quoted in the score. Here's the Lisztian return. You'll see later. He even quoted in the score as saying about the rhythmic pattern, and you can see what was in his head, kind of a primal dance going on. And this feel is indicated with changing meters and over the bar line figurations, and again the restlessness of beginning sections with a rest, an 8th rest or a 16th rest. So I'd like to go back and play those little sections. Theme 4 does return another time, even developed. So here's the first one, and you can hear the brusqueness, the savage type of sound, the image that he had in mind. And he goes on. So when theme 4 comes back, it's actually in a partial return, truncated, which is what he does sometimes. You can hear only where it starts in the 2/4. And then we go into the burlesca, his other section. Theme 6 contains some of these bird calls, like we heard in the 4th sonata in the 3rd movement. And you'll be able to hear this predating, again, Messiaen's usage of this. This is a very calm linewood section. Again, his way of juxtaposing extreme simplicity with extreme complexity comes out with this sandwiched in between some of these sections. So this is the theme 6, the bird call material. Also comes back again towards the very end, this time in a different key, but pretty much the same texture. So that is theme 6 coming back. Now, I'd like to play the entire movement so that you can hear each theme clearly. And I think it's comparable, again, to a very complex play. So while I play this, I'm going to have flashing on the projector the different sections as they come up so that you can hear clearly the delineation. Also, there are pictures that go with some of these. Ornstein had very specific images in mind. Some of them he wrote quotes into the score of what he was thinking. And so I've added some pictures as well. This movement is entitled, he calls it Life's Turmoil and a Few Bits of Satire. walk through the other movements of this piece. The second movement, in contrast, and as in the fourth sonata, are very short tonal children's pieces, very programmatic and little vignettes, and written with key signatures, unlike the outer movements again. And this simplicity is kind of a break from the first movement. Ornstein actually, again, wrote directly in the score, "Some may object to the middle four vignettes as an intrusion. Others may find them a distinct contrast and relief from the brusqueness of the rest of the sonata." And this also proves that he wrote for what he considered what the music demanded, because he wanted to write standard conventional forms as well as unusual sectional, atonal, and dissonant things. And in this one sonata, Severo actually made a reference that people had to listen to the whole thing. They couldn't listen to one style of his or the others. So it was all over the map, using all of these compositional techniques. Janice Weber and Marc-André Hamelin had also commented that it was like a collage of all of these different aspects of his compositions. These are the second movement titles. The entire thing is "A Trip to the Attic" and "Tier 2 for a Childhood Forever Gone." And these are very simplistic children's songs that we'll later hear one of them. And the third movement, the final movement, is chaos, even more chaos than the first movement. And the most important thing that glues this together, though, is a single theme that keeps returning. The rest of it intertwined in and around this theme that returns is this discontinuous passage work again that has an obsessive quality. And again, the feature that comes back here, like in the first movement, is the usage of this rest to start the sections, an 8th rest or a 16th rest that sounds like a gasp before them, and it really creates more of a sense of motion. And it seldom settles down harmonically. This whole movement is kind of a pick your tonality type of feel to it. So here are the returning themes. I'd like to just play a few swatches of these to get an idea. This is the theme in its original form. And again, you can hear, if you just look at the melody line on top, simple enough. Until you get the rest of the harmonies underneath it. Another example when it comes back is a different key area. Later, actually, the bottom section. And it just gets progressively more intense sounding. Here's another one. So it grows in intensity using these different intervals. There's one section in this movement that is actually written with a key signature, only for about 3 lines. He writes in C sharp minor, and this is where the theme comes back in its slowest, most expressive form. The middle one here in C sharp minor. And then right away he goes back to his regular system of writing out all of the accidentals. The final appearance is in big octaves. Again, this is a type of post-romantic style of writing. Not the tonality, of course, but the textures. So this is the theme that really glues all of it together, and also demonstrates his mastery of variation, keeping the material constantly changing without sounding dull. I'd like to move now to the performance issues. Some of the technical challenges, the passage work is of course challenging to work out, but it's also an indication of what a superb pianist Ornstein was, because once this is worked out, it actually fits nicely into the hand, despite its chaotic sound. One of the biggest challenges is there are so many sections to deal with, especially in the 8th sonata, in the first movement and the third movement, keeping the material sounding fresh by bringing out certain things within the texture or the use of dynamics to make these so that it doesn't stagnate after some time. And just dealing with the sheer complexity, the symphonic proportions of it, putting together these different layers in a way where it sounds intelligible and it's not overwhelming. The pedal issues, he had very specific ideas about pedal. He would often indicate a quarter or a half pedal, like fluttering the pedal or riding on the pedal for more of a blend of sound for harmonic color changes rather than distinct delineation of harmonic changes. And this goes along with his writing too, the harmonic ambiguity, and the pedal does help with that. I think the biggest distraction is his system of writing out every single accidental in the measure. It takes a while to shift perspectives on that, and it's a very natural system. The challenge is going back when you're reading other material after that, but I did like the way that he did that. This is the only composer that I know of that wrote in that manner. I'd like to close with one of the short vignettes from the 8th sonata. This is one of the vignettes from the second movement, and it's called First Carousel Ride and Sounds of a Hurdy-Gurdy. And in this, you can hear very distinct Russian folk characteristics, even reminiscent of Stravinsky. So I'd like to play that before closing.